Time I saw Rudolf, I was a student. I was 20 years old, and I was working in the box office actually at Covent Garden, and the ballet was Giselle. And I remember him coming on, his arms full of lilies. He was searching for Giselle's grave. And it was such a compelling, tragic image. You were just rooted to him, even though he hadn't, in fact, danced a step.
I was 13 years of age in New Zealand when my father had more or less forced me to go and watch this film of Rudolf Nureyev, An Evening of the Royal Ballet. It was a film which influenced me to such a degree that I decided in my life that is what I wanted to do, to be a dancer.
Rudolf Nureyev is often described as the greatest male dancer in the history of classical ballet. Over the quarter century of his career, he attracted sell-out audiences wherever he went, many of whom were only there because it was Nureyev. Four years after his death, the legend remains firmly in place. No one could do it like Rudolf. He was the noble prince par excellence, superhumanly gifted, and able to leap higher and turn faster than any dancer before or since. The facts of the case, however, are rather more complex than the Western ballet establishment has seen fit to promote. On 17th of June, 1961, age 23, Rudolf Nureyev defected at Le Bourget Airport, Paris, during a tour by the Kirov Ballet Company of Leningrad. KGB files indicate that his defection was carefully planned and that London, not Paris, was his intended place of asylum. Realizing that his plans had been discovered, Nureyev was forced to make his move in France.
Nureyev — это одна сотая часть выехавшей труппы на гастроли.
And the only thing he can tell is that Nureyev is the 100th part of all the participants of this guest tour.
Nureyev soon found his way to London. There he found a cultural revolution, the austerity of the post-war years being swept away. The West was in a party mood, and the gatecrasher was devoured by the press and public alike. He was young, he was beautiful, and he brought with him the dark glamour which, at the height of the Cold War, was attached to all things Russian. The timing of his arrival ensured that, more than any dancer before or since, Nureyev achieved crossover into the cultural mainstream. The male image was in the process of redefinition. And just as Mick Jagger became the pop singer and George Best the footballer, Nureyev became the dancer. New York was the Royal Ballet's home from home. There, as in London, the young Russian was lionized.
Rudolf was an idol in New York. He was a symbol of the times, of the 60s. He was seen to be an extension of the whole swinging England thing, the Beatles, the new narcissism for men, the long hair. He was absolutely adored in New York.
This celebrity came at a price. In Nureyev's absence, a Soviet judge sentenced him to 7 years in prison. Nureyev's family suffered greatly, as he must have known that they would. His father, Hamet, a political commissar, saw his career destroyed. His mother and sisters, desperate for the relief from drudgery that Rudolf's position as a Kirov ballet principal would have brought, instead found themselves ostracized as members of a criminal family. For many years, and through a variety of messengers, they pleaded unsuccessfully with Nureyev to return, to make things right. In 1963, Nureyev appeared on the covers of Time and Newsweek in the same week. In New York, his staging of the Petipa classic, Le Bayadère, became something of a cult event.
In La Bayadère, there's the famous sequence at the beginning of the shade scene where 28 girls come down a ramp in single file, all repeating the same step to a very hypnotic effect. This became sort of a 60s thing for people to drop acid or snort coke or take mescaline before the shade scene in La Bayadère.
It was London, however, and not New York, that Nureyev made his home. The reputation of the Royal Ballet as the West's finest company rested on the shoulders of its principal choreographer, Frederick Ashton, and of its prima ballerina, Margot Fontaine. The company's male dancers were rather lower-profile figures, partners of the ballerinas rather than stars in their own right. The senior male principal was Michael Soames. His successors, it seemed, had already been chosen.
There were dancers who had hoped to take on the mantle of Soames, and, well, I think David Blair had started to dance with Margot. So had Christopher Gable. There was a strata in the company that had their noses put out of joint, really. You know, that's what happens in this business. Someone comes and they pull the carpet from under your feet.
In Russia, male dancers were stars, and far greater virtuosity was demanded of them than in the West. But there is more to ballet than virtuosity and flash. In class, his fellow dancers saw a different Nureyev. For although he applied himself ruthlessly to the task of acquiring and maintaining his classical technique, Nureyev would struggle to the end of his days for the placement, the whole physical geometry of ballet that had been instilled into his colleagues as children. Nureyev was well aware of his shortcomings, and unlike his adoring claque, never fell into the trap of believing everything that was written about him.
I remember quite early in Covent Garden, I said, "Oh, you're wonderful, Rudolf," something like that at the stage door, and he looked at me in amazement and he said, "You think I good? You want to see Soloviev."
Nureyev was right. His classmate, Yuri Soloviev, the ultimate Leningrad purist, was unquestionably the finer dancer. Whilst for sheer thrilling bravura, the Bolshoi's Vladimir Vasilyev reigned unchallenged.
He had a strong body, but he didn't have a supple body. He did not have high extensions. He did not have incredible feet. His lines were not that incredible either. So he had a lot to fight for, and often when you saw him work at the bar in the center, it was a struggle. He was really almost fighting a war with his body and pushing it into shape.
What Nureyev had was passion. His stage persona was constructed from a series of tantalizing contradictions. He was a low-born Bashkiri and the noblest and most arrogant of princes. A predatory homosexual and the very embodiment of romantic heterosexual love.
He adored working with ladies on stage. You can see the relationship with Margot. There was a love relationship there. This comes through to the public, that the fact, all right, so his sexuality is neither important one way or the other, but the fact that it comes through, it makes him lovable both to the masculine side of the audience as well as the lady side. He had the best of both worlds. He loved his women as perhaps as he loved his men on stage and off.
As the stage lover of the Royal Ballet's Margot Fonteyn, nearly 20 years his senior, Nureyev displayed an almost painful tenderness. From those who knew him, Nureyev never concealed his homosexuality, but it was his partnership with Fonteyn and the intriguing questions it raised concerning their offstage relationship which captured the public imagination.
Anytime Fonteyn appeared in New York, it was either a state occasion or perceived as a state occasion. Not only because of her own social standing, but her greatness and prestige as an artist. Especially in the role of Aurora, she was literally perceived by Americans as being a surrogate for the Queen of England. Her prestige was absolutely unassailable. She was one of the few ballet dancers, if not the only ballet dancer, whose name alone could sell out the Metropolitan Opera House. So for her to have chosen to dance with Rudolf gave him an extra edge of respectability and seriousness, because she was not thought by anyone to be a reckless woman, even though she was arrested for gun running in Panama.
Nureyev enjoyed 5 golden years in the West. 5 years in which his physical facility matched his supreme theatricality. But a technique won in desperate haste, as Nureyev's had been, will depart before one whose foundations have been more gently laid. By the late 60s, his dancing was losing its Leningrad bloom. At Covent Garden, a new generation was taking its place on the stage. Lyrical dancers like Anthony Dow could do anything that Nureyev could do, not with quite the same theatricality perhaps, but with far greater finesse.
There were certain things that I liked very much of him as a performer, which I knew I could never do. I wasn't that personality. And on the other hand, there were things that I didn't really like in the performances too, which fascinated me to know how, I mean this with the greatest respect, but how he got away with some of those things.
What sort of things do you mean?
I suppose, although he was always very immersed, that sometimes it was very much that the world and that performance was revolving around him.
As an exile, Nureyev yearned for a permanent artistic home, ideally with the Royal Ballet. It was not to be. By the early 70s, it was clear that the Nureyev-Royal Ballet marriage was coming to an end. He was 37 years old, and his technique was beginning to slip away. His jumps were visibly effortful, and his lower back strength, essential for balletic line, was waning.
The Royal Ballet could not become just a vehicle and a backup group. And he wanted to be on more, and the directors of those time, whether it be Kenneth or Fred, knew that there were other artists to develop as well. And I think that's where the sad partings of the way were. I think for a time he felt quite bitter about that, which was a great disappointment to us all.
Rudolf Nureyev was the first defective from the Russian ballet. He came to the West at a very young age, 23 years old. I was exactly 10 years older, and I had reached a point where I was considered the world's foremost dancer, male dancer. And there wasn't that much of a competition around that would inspire me. He became that. The very different technique, his personality, I took as an inspiration. If I were his age, I probably wouldn't be able to accept him being around.
We didn't really correct each other ever. We used to do one by one. You know, I would start or he would start. He always brought up, this is not Russian. As it isn't Russian. And there's something else besides Russia. This is Danish. It may not be what you like, but it's not necessarily wrong because it isn't Russian. I seem to have a sense of humor that he could accept very easily, whereas sometimes my sense of humor might insult some people or hurt them. But he thought it was hilarious.
Nureyev felt the royals' rejection keenly and embarked on a non-stop world tour, appearing with all the West's major ballet companies. Life as an itinerant guest star was often a lonely business. Constant touring made long-term relationships impossible, and lovers came and went. Nureyev became morbidly promiscuous, scouring the homosexual quartier for casual partners. Physically, the consequences of his unremitting schedule were cruel.
He was dancing too much. This was the problem. He never gave rest at the body, the ankle, the muscles. He was dancing too much.
He'd fly in from New York in the morning, go to bed in the afternoon, and come in here and do Swan Lake in the evening. I mean, his schedules were as tight as that.
You'd see him in the dressing room, wrapping his legs up, putting on oil and kind of heating creams and things, just trying to get the swollen tendons to be able to move. And you'd stand behind him and he'd do a pliés and try to do a tendu, and you'd see this foot, which it was almost like it was kind of set in concrete. And you'd know that he'd be dancing Swan Lake or Giselle or Romeo. That evening, finally, he just kind of wore out.
He was terrible lonely, Rudolf. Terrible lonely, terrible. He was very timid also. This was why he was aggressive, you know.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is now your Act 2 beginners call. Act 2 beginners, Mr. Lott, Mr. Allen and Mr. Gallo.
His preparations for performances became increasingly extreme.
He needed the adrenaline somehow to get him going for the performance. So somehow he would create almost a situation where he could release a bit of anger or... That's true.
By the 1980s, Nureyev's performances were essentially triumphs of the will, sustained by personality alone. And yet, incredibly, Nureyev would continue to dance until 1992, when he was 54 years old. To the end, he was marketed as the world's greatest dancer, a process in which he wryly colluded. Some watchers denied the evidence of their eyes, others departed bemused. By the end, his performances were almost unwatchable. He was dancing for himself alone.
I had to do a matinee here at the Met, and he seemed really very disturbed about something and a bit out of it. So it really worried me because he'd come late for certain moves in the pas de deux and Nutcracker, and it was scary.
It was hard for some of us in the end to see him dance certain things, yes.
Why, the world wondered, did Nureyev continue? He was a millionaire many times over and wanted for nothing. What drove him, despite age and injury, to flog himself round the provincial circuit in ever more threadbare productions? As a child of the Soviet state, he grew up within a system in which nonconformism of any kind, political or sexual, was instantly condemned. If there was an aristocracy in the USSR, and an antithesis to the bleak circumstances of Nureyev's upbringing, it was the great ballet theaters. Outside waited the barbarians. Little wonder, then, that he determined to hold on to ballet literally unto death. God, he believed, had marked him out as special with the gift of dance, and, he promised, I will never let it go. Nureyev died of AIDS in a Paris hospital in January 1993. The tragedy of his later career is that the legend overtook the man. He was sold as a technical marvel when, in truth, his greatness lay in the extraordinary expressiveness he achieved despite his technical limitations. His theatricality was absolute, and the whirlwind of his early years changed classical ballet forever. For this, long after they have forgotten the others, they will remember Rudolf Nureyev.